Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we're going to continue our usual Wednesday poetry, prose, and riddles stream. Last week we finished on a poem by John Keats. As a quick reminder, John Keats was an English poet of the second generation of Romantic poets with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, though his poems had been in publication for less than 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25. They were indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death. So that was the individual. As usual, we will begin by my rereading the last poem we finished off on, and then we will move on. So, Ode to a Nightingale. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and Lethwards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. O for a draught of vintage, that hath been cooled for a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. O for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale, and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and laden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, our new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy. Though the dull brain perplexes and retards, already with thee, tender as the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry phase, but here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows, the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many amused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown, perhaps a selfsame song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when sick for home. She stood in tears amid the alien corn, the same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell, to tell me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades, past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So it was Ode to a Nightingale. So, starting, or rather continuing with this week's first new poem, we have Ode to a Grecian Urn. Sorry, I apologise. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Goodness me. In this anthology we have quite a lot of Keats. Not that I'm complaining, I've been rather impressed with his poetry so far. So, I will begin with the first reading of Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities and mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loth? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared. Pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave, thy song nor ever can these trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the girl, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. For ever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodious unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, or breathing human passion far above. that leaves a heart high sorrowed and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest? Leadest thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? And little town, thy streets for evermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell, while thou art desolate, can ever return. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marbled men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodded weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, this is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Goodness me, there's a lot to unpack there. So I think I may begin with the little cheat or shortcut that I've been doing recently with the more difficult poems, which is to look up the Wikipedia page on that particular poem and see what it has to say, because there is enough going on here that I think it would take me untenably long to try and dissect it all myself, especially since there's probably a lot of context that I don't know. After we've done this, then we'll go back to the normal analysis that we would do, beginning with words we don't recognise and so on and so forth. Ode on a Grecian Urn is a poem written by the English Romantic poet John Keats in May 1819. First published anonymously in the Annals of Fine Arts for 1819. The poem is one of the great odes of 1819, which also include Ode on Indolence, Ode on Melancholy, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode to Psyche. Keats found existing forms in poetry unsatisfactory for his purpose, and in this collection he presented a new development of the ode form. He was inspired to write the poem after reading two articles by English artist and writer Benjamin Haydon. There was awareness of other writings in this field, and his first-hand acquaintance with the Elgin marbles. Keats perceived the idealism and representation of Greek virtues in classical Greek art, and his poem draws upon these insights. In 5 stanzas of 10 lines each, the poet addresses an ancient Greek urn, describing and discoursing upon the images depicted on it. In particular, he reflects upon 2 scenes, one in which a lover pursues his beloved, and another where villagers and a priest gather to perform a sacrifice. The poet concludes that the urn will say to the future generations of mankind, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. This is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Critics have debated whether these lines adequately perfect the conception of the poem. Critics have also focused on the role of the speaker, the power of material objects to inspire, and the paradoxical interrelation between the worldly and the ideal reality in the poem. Ode on a Grecian Urn was not well received by contemporary critics. It was only by the mid-19th century that it began to be praised. It is now considered to be one of the greatest odes in the English language. A long debate over the poem's final statement divided 20th century critics, but most agreed on the beauty of the work, despite certain perceived inadequacies. So, I don't intend to read the entire Wikipedia article, but let's see what it has to say about the background to the poem. By the spring of 1819, Keats had left his job as assistant house surgeon, where he dressed wounds at Guy's Hospital, Southwark, London, to devote himself entirely to the composition of poetry. Living with his friend Charles Brown, the 23-year-old was burdened with money problems and despaired when his brother George sought his financial assistance. These real-world difficulties may have given Keats pause for thought about a career in poetry, Yet he did manage to complete 5 odes, including Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Psyche, Ode on Melancholy, Ode on Indolence, and Ode on a Grecian Urn. The poems were transcribed by Brown, who later provided copies to the publisher Richard Woodhouse. Their exact date of composition is unknown. Keats simply dated Ode to a Grecian Urn May 1819, as he did its companion odes. While the 5 poems display a unity in stanza forms and themes, the unity fails to provide clear evidence of the order in which they were composed. In the Odes of 1819, Keats explores his contemplations about the relationship between the soul, eternity, nature, and art. His idea of using classical Greek art as a metaphor originated in his reading of Haydn's Examiner articles of the 2nd of May and 9th of May 1819. I'm guessing the Examiner is a newspaper? It was a weekly paper founded by Lay and John Hunt in 1808. It was an intellectual journal. In the first article, Haydn described Greek sacrifice and worship, and in the second article he contrasted the artistic styles of Raphael and Michelangelo in conjunction with a discussion of medieval sculptures. Keats also had access to prints of Greek urns at Haydn's office, and he traced an engraving of the Sosibios vase, which I have no doubt I'm butchering the pronunciation of, a Neo-Attic marble volute crater signed by Sosibius in the Louvre, which he found in Henry Moses, a collection of antique vases, altars, and petare, I think, but I'm no doubt mispronouncing that as well. Keats' inspiration for the topic was not limited to Haydn, but embraced many contemporary sources. He may have recalled his experience with the Elgin marbles and their influence on his sonnet On Seeing the Elgin Marbles. He was also exposed to the Townley, Borghese, and Holland House vases, and to the classical treatment of subjects in Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy. Many contemporary essays and articles on these works shared Keats' view that classical Greek art was both idealistic and captured Greek virtues. He was influenced by examples of existing Greek vases. In the poem, he attempted to describe an ideal artistic type rather than a specific original vase. Although Ode on a Grecian Urn was completed in May 1819, its first printing came in January 1820 when it was published with Ode to a Nightingale in the Annals of Fine Art, an art magazine that promoted views on art similar to those Keats held. Following the initial publication, the Examiner published Keats' Ode together with Haydn's 2 previously published articles. Keats also included the poem in the 1820 collection Lamia Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes, and Other Poems. Structure. In 1819, Keats had attempted to write sonnets, but found that the form did not satisfy his purpose because the pattern of rhyme worked against the tone they wished to achieve. When he turned to the ode form, he found that the standard Pindaric form used by poets such as John Dryden was inadequate for properly discussing philosophy. Keats developed his own type of ode in Ode to Psyche, which preceded Ode on a Grecian Urn and other odes he wrote in 1819. Keats' creation established a new poetic tone that accorded with his aesthetic ideals about poetry. He further altered his new form in Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn by adding secondary voice within the ode, creating a dialogue between 2 subjects. The technique of the poem is ekphrasis. The word ekphrasis or ekphrasis comes from the Greek for the written description of a work of art produces a rhetorical or literary exercise often used in the adjectival form ekphrasistic. I may be mispronouncing these. It is a vivid, often dramatic verbal description of a visual work of art. The poetic representation of a painting or sculpture in words, Keats broke from the traditional use of ekphrasis found in Theocritus's Idyll, a classical poem that describes the design on the side of a cup. While Theocritus describes both motion found in a stationary artwork and underlying motives of character, Ode on a Grecian Urn replaces actions with a series of questions and focuses only on external attributes of the character. Ode on a Grecian Urn is organised into 10-line stanzas beginning with an ABAB rhyme scheme and ending with a tonic sestet. first and fifth stanzas, C, D, E, D, C, E. Second stanza, C, D, E, C, E, D. Interesting. And third and fourth stanzas, C, D, E, C, D, E. The same overall pattern is used in Ode on Indolence, Ode on Melancholy, and Ode to a Nightingale, though their sestet rhyme scheme vary, which makes this poem unified in structure as well as theme. The word ode itself is of Greek origin, meaning sung, while ode writers from antiquity adhered to rigid patterns of strophe, antistrophe, and epode. The form by Keats' time had undergone enough transformation that it represented a manner rather than a set method for writing a certain type of lyric poetry. Keats' odes seek to find a classical balance between two extremes. In the structure of Ode on a Grecian Urn, these extremes are the symmetrical structure of classical literature and the asymmetry of romantic poetry. The use of AB structure in the beginning lines of each stanza represents a clear example of structure found in classical literature, and the remaining 6 lines appear to break free of the traditional poetic styles of Greek and Roman odes. Keats' metre reflects a conscious development in his poetic style. The poem contains only a single instance of medial inversion, the reversal of an iamb in the middle of a line, which was common in his earlier works. However, Keats incorporates spondees in the 37 of the 250 metrical feet. Caesare are never placed before the 4th syllable in a line. The word choice represents a shift from Keats' early reliance on Latinate polysyllabic words to shorter Germanic words. In this second stanza, Ode on a Grecian Urn, which emphasizes words containing the letters P, B, V, uses syzygy, the repetition of consonantal sound. The poem incorporates a complex reliance on assonance, which is found in very few English poems. Within Ode on a Grecian Urn, an example of this pattern can be found in line 13, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, where the E of sensual connects with the E of endeared, and the E of ear connects with the E of endeared. The poem begins with the narrator silencing the urn by describing it as the bride of quietness, which allows him to speak for it using his own impressions. The narrator addresses the urn by saying, "Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time." The urn is a foster child of silence and slow time because it was created from stone and made by the hand of an artist who did not communicate through words. As stone, time has little effect on it, and aging is such a slow process that it can be seen as an eternal piece of artwork. The urn is an external object capable of producing a story outside the time of its creation, and because of this ability, the poet labels it a sylvan historian that tells its story through its beauty. Sylvan historian who can't... well, we'll read that again when I do the second reading. The questions presented in these lines are too ambiguous to allow the reader to understand what is taking place in the images on the urn. But elements of it are revealed. There is a pursuit with a strong sexual component. The melody accompanying the pursuit is intensified in the second stanza. There is a hint of paradox in that indulgence causes someone to be filled with desire, and that music without a sound is desired by the soul. There is a stasis that prohibits the character on the urn from ever being fulfilled. In the third stanza, the narrator begins by speaking to a tree which will ever hold its leaves and will not bid the spring adieu. The paradox of life versus lifelessness extends beyond the lover and the fair lady, and takes a more temporal shape as 3 of the 10 lines begin with the words forever. The unheard song never ages, and the pipes are able to play forever, which leads the lover's nature and all involved to be a new paradox arises in these lines because these immortal lovers are experiencing a living death. To overcome this paradox of merged life and death, the poem shifts to a new scene with a new perspective. The fourth stanza opens with the sacrifice of a virgin cow, an image that appeared in the Elgin marbles, Claude Lorraine's sacrifice to Apollo, and Raphael's sacrifice of Lystra. All that exists in the scene is a procession of individuals, and the narrator conjectures on the rest. The altar and the town exist as part of a world outside art, and the poem challenges the limitations of art through describing their possible existence. The questions are unanswered because there is no one who can ever know the true answers, as the locations are not real. The final stanza begins with a reminder that the urn is a piece of eternal artwork. The audience is limited in its ability to comprehend the eternal scene, but the silent urn is still able to speak to them. The story it tells is both cold and passionate, and is able to help mankind. The poem concludes with the urn's message. So I think that will do for now. That'll certainly do for reading that Wikipedia article. So even then, I'd say there's a lot to unpack here. But I think I have a clearer idea of what's going on in this poem. So I will move on to a second reading, then we will look at any words that we don't recognise. Then we will look at the rhyming and rhythmic schemes, although quite a lot of that has already been covered by the... In fact, they have both been covered by the Wikipedia article, so we don't need to do that. Other than acknowledge the fact that they exist. There is a meter to this poem, or at least a rhythmic structure, and there is rhyme. Although, as the Wikipedia article explained, it's quite complex. And while I'm doing all this, if you have any questions, please put them into chat, and when I see them, I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. So, second reading. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-ringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities and mortals or both, in the Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What man or gods are these? What maiden's loth, what mad pursuit, what struggle to escape, what pipes and timbrels, what wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared. Pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss. Though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. For ever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy, melodious, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, or breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowed and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are those coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest? Leadest thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? Or little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell, while thou art desolate, can ever return. O Attic shape, fair attitude would breed of marbled men and maidens overwrought with forest branches and the trodden weed. Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as does eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall still generations waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe. Then ours a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. So, words we don't recognise, and if there's any you don't recognise or aren't sure about, please say so in chat and we will look them up. Sylvan. It says here a surname, but I haven't the slightest doubt it has another meaning. Pertaining to the forest or woodlands. That makes sense. From the Latin Sylvanus, Roman god of the woods. So Tempe and presumably Arcady are locations. Loth. Oh, it's just a form of loaf and is presumably pronounced the same. Although, to be fair, if it's rhyming with both, then it should be loaf. Sorry, both and loath. Yet loathe makes more sense. Strange. Cloyd. To fill up or choke up, to stop up, to clog, to fill to loathing, to survey. Breed. Ornamental embroidery or a braid. Neither really makes sense. Oh, attic shape, fair attitude with breed. Oh, odd. Okay, I think that's all the words I could think of to look up. So I'll move on to the third and final reading of this poem, as we have already covered rhyme and rhythm in the Wikipedia article. So if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss, please leave a comment in chat and I will read it when I've finished. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence in slow time, sylvan historian who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme, what leaf-ringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities and mortals or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady, what men or gods are these, what maidens loathe, what mad pursuit, what struggle to escape, what pipes and timbrels, what wild ecstasy. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, therefore ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, what cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever painting and forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadest thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can ever return. O Attic shape, fair attitude with braid of marbled men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as does eternity cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe, then ours a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all ye need to know. So, moving on, this next poem, also from John Keats, is entitled To Autumn. Seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, till they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who has not seen these oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-roofed furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies while they hook, spares the next swath and all its twined flowers, and sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the lazy oozings hour by hour. Where are the songs of spring? Ay, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. While bared clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river's sallows, borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind leaves or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with trebles soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. Goodness me, that's another difficult one. Either that or I'm just foolish. Both are possible. So again, we will look through the accompanying Wikipedia article and then we will move on to other analysis. To Autumn is a poem by English Romantic poet John Keats. The work was composed on the 19th of September 1819, so this would have been later than Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on a Grecian Urn. And published in 1820 in a volume of Keats' poetry that included Lamia and the Eve of St. Agnes. To Autumn is the final work in a group of poems known as Keats' 1819 Odes. Although personal problems left him little time to devote to poetry in 1819, he composed To Autumn after a walk near Winchester one autumnal evening. The work marks the end of his poetic career, as he needed to earn money and could no longer devote himself to the lifestyle of a poet. A little over a year after the publication of To Autumn, Keats died in Rome. The poem has 3 11-line stanzas which describe a progression through the season, from late maturation of the crops to the harvest and to the last days of autumn when winter is nearing. The imagery is richly achieved through the personification of autumn and the description of its bounty, its sights and sounds. It has parallels in the work of English landscape artists, with Keats himself describing the fields of stubble that he saw on his walk as conveying the warmth of some pictures. The work has been interpreted as a meditation on death, as an allegory of artistic creation, as Keats responds to the Peterloo Massacre, which took place in the same year, and as an expression of nationalist sentiment. One of the most anthologized English lyric poems, To Autumn has been regarded by critics as one of the most perfect short poems in the English language. Background. During the spring of 1819, Keats wrote many of his major odes: Odes on a Grecian Urn, Ode on Indolence, Ode on Melancholy, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode to Psyche. After the month of May, he began to pursue other forms of poetry, including the verse tragedy Otho the Great, in collaboration with a friend and roommate Charles Brown, the second half of Lamia, and a return to his unfinished epic, Hyperion. His efforts from spring until autumn were dedicated completely to a career in poetry, alternating between writing long and short poems and setting himself a goal to compose more than 50 lines of verse each day. In his free time, he also read works as varied as Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, Thomas Chatterton's poetry, and Leigh Hunt's essays. Although Keats managed to write many poems in 1819, he was suffering from a multitude of financial troubles throughout the year, including concerns over his brother George, who, after emigrating to America, was badly in need of money. Despite these distractions, on the 19th of September 1819, he found time to write To Autumn. The poem marks the final moment of his career as a poet. No longer able to afford to devote his time to the composition of poems, he began working on more lucrative projects. Keats' declining health and personal responsibilities also raised obstacles in his continuing poetic efforts. On the 19th of September 1819, Keats walked near Winchester along the River Itchen. In a letter to his friend John Hamilton Reynolds, written on the 21st of September, Keats described the impression the scene had made upon him and its influence on the composition of To Autumn. How beautiful the season is now, how fine the air, a temperate sharpness about it. I never liked stubble fields so much as now. Somehow a stubble plain looks warm in the same way that some pictures look warm. This struck me so much in my Sunday's walk that I composed upon it. Not everything on Keats' mind at the time was bright. The poet knew in September that he would have to finally abandon Hyperion. Thus, in the letter that he wrote to Reynolds, Keats also included a note saying that he abandoned his long poem. Keats did not send To Autumn to Reynolds, but did include the poem within a letter to Richard Woodhouse, his publisher and a friend, and dated it on the same day. The poem was revised and included in Keats' 1820 collection of poetry titled Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes and Other Poems. Although the publishers, Taylor and Hesse, feared the kind of bad reviews that had plagued Keats' 1818 edition of Endymion, they were willing to publish the collection after removal of any potentially controversial poems to ensure that there would be no politically motivated reviews that could give the volume a bad reputation. Themes. To Autumn describes in its three stanzas three different aspects of the season: its fruitfulness, its labour, and its ultimate decline. Through the stanzas there is a progression from early autumn to mid-autumn, and then to the heralding of winter. Parallel to this, the poem depicts the day turning from morning to the afternoon and into dusk. These progressions are joined with a shift from the tactile sense to that of sight and then of sound, creating a three-part symmetry which is not present in Keats' other odes. As the poem progresses, autumn is represented metaphorically as one who conspires, who ripens fruit, who harvests, who makes music. The first stanza of the poem represents autumn as involved with the promotion of natural processes, growth, and ultimate maturation. Two forces in opposition in nature, but together creating the impression that the season will not end. In this stanza, the fruits are still ripening, the buds still opening in the warm weather. Stuart Sperry says that Keats emphasises the tactile senses suggested by the imagery of growth and gentle motion, swelling, bending, and plumping. In the second stanza, autumn is personified as a harvester, to be seen by the viewer in various guises performing labouring tasks essential to the provision of food for the coming year. There is a lack of definitive action, all motion being gentle. Autumn is not depicted as actually harvesting, but as seated, resting, or watching. In lines 14 to 15, the personification of autumn is an exhausted labourer. In the end of the stanza, the steadiness of the gleaner in lines 19 to 20 again emphasise a motionlessness within the poem. The progression through the day is revealed in actions that are all suggestive of the drowsiness of afternoon. The harvested grain is being winnowed, the harvester is asleep or returning home, the last drops issue from the cider press. The last stanza contrasts autumn's sound with those of spring. The sounds that are presented are not only those of autumn, but essentially the gentle sounds of the evening. Gnats wail and lambs bleat in the dusk. As night approaches, within the final moments of the song, death is slowly approaching alongside the end of the year. The full-grown lambs, like the grapes, gourds, and hazelnuts, will be harvested for the winter. The twittering swallows gather for departure, leaving the fields bare. The whistling redbreast and chirping cricket are the common sounds of winter. The references to spring, the growing lambs and the migrating swallows remind the reader that the seasons are a cycle, widening the scope of this stanza from a single season to life in general. Of all Keats' poems, To Autumn, with its catalogue of concrete images, most closely describes a paradise as realised on earth, while also focusing on archetypical symbols connected with the season. Within the poem, autumn represents growth, maturation, finally an approaching death. There is a fulfilling union between the ideal and the real. Scholars have noted a number of literary influences on To Autumn, from Virgil's Georgics to Edmund Spenser's Mutability Cantos, to the language of Thomas Chatterton, to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, to an essay on autumn by Leigh Hunt, which Keats had recently read. To Autumn is thematically connected to other odes that Keats wrote in 1819. For example, in his Ode to Melancholy, a major theme is the acceptance of the process of life. When this theme appears later in To Autumn, however, it is with a difference. This time, the figure of the poet disappears, and there is no exhaustion of an imaginary reader. There's no exhortation of an imaginary reader. There are no open conflicts, and the dramatic debate, protest, and qualification are absent. In process, there is a harmony between the finality of death and the hints of renewal of life in the cycle of the seasons, paralleled by the renewal of a single day. Critics have tended to emphasize different aspects of this process. Some have focused upon focused on renewal. Water checks and bait pointed to the theme of each stanza, including its contrary idea. Here, death implying, though only indirectly, the renewal of life. Also noted by both Bate and Jennifer Wagner, the structure of the verse reinforces the sense of something to come, and placing of the couplet before the end of each stanza creates a feeling of suspension, highlighting the theme of continuation. I don't think we need to read all of this. But that should give us a clearer idea of what the poem is about. So I will move on to the second reading before subsequently moving on to various analyses. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eave run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells, with a sweet kernel to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, till they think warm days will never cease, for summer has over-brimmed their clammy cells. Who have not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twinned flowers, and sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watches the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then a wailful choir the small gnats mourn, among the river's sallows borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with a treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So, we will move on to looking up words that we don't recognise. If there is a word you would like looked up or discussed, please leave a comment in chat. Season of Mist... Oh, sorry. Gleaner. I know what to glean would mean, but I'm not familiar with the expression gleaner. To collect grain, grapes, etc. left behind after the main harvest or gathering. I didn't know that. I was familiar with to gather information in small amounts with implied difficulty bit by bit. So it's from this concrete meaning to collect grain left behind after the main harvest that we get the figurative meaning of to gather information in small amounts with implied difficulty. Interesting. Bard. Obviously it could mean to have bars, but I'm not sure what they mean by barred clouds. I'm not sure what the author means by while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day. Sallows. So, sallows means to become yellowish? Oh, swallows, sorry, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. No, sorry, that's later on. I missed it. Among the river's sallows, born aloft. So that is sallows. Become sallow to cause something to become sallow. Or it could mean foul, murky, or sickly. A willow twig or branch. Aha! That must be what it means. Among the river sallows born aloft. That would be the gnats. Born. As in, from hilly born, not born aloft. A small stream or brook. Or destination or limit. Croft. I feel like I should know what a croft is. Yeah, I think it may be one of those words that I just accepted without thinking. An enclosed piece of land, especially small and arable, and used for small-scale food production, and often with a dwelling next to it. In particular, such a piece of land rented to a farmer, a crofter, especially in Scotland, together with a right to use separate pasture land shared by other crofters, to do agricultural work, to place on the ground in the open air. Underground chamber, a crypt, an undercroft. Ah, that would be the sense of the word that I was familiar with. A cave or cavern. But I think it's more locally the poem is referring to an enclosed piece of land, usually small and arable. Okay, so I think that's all the words that needed looking up. Rhythm and rhyme. Well, clearly fruitfulness and bless. Sun run. Cormore. Trees and bees, although they aren't next to each other. Shells and cells. Is cease on its own? think it is. I think it's clear from the use of words like fruitfulness that this isn't going to be simply iambic or trochaic, because you wouldn't say fruitfulness, so we can rule that out. But a brief look at it, that of course is to do with rhythm. As far as rhyme is concerned, we can see rhyme is present, but that it doesn't follow a simple structure. I strongly suspect that this poem comes under the same category as Keats' other works, that he was developing his own structures, and that there is a structure there, but that it's quite complex. That goes for both rhyme and rhythm. So with that said, I will move on to the third and final reading. Again, if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to discuss, please leave a comment in chat and I will look at it after I've finished. To Autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the fat eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells, with a sweet kernel to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowse with the fume of poppies while they hook, spares with next swath and all its twinned flowers, and sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Ay, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too. Or bar clouds bloom, and soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then a wailful choir the small gnats mourn, among the river's sallows borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So, that concludes the poetry for this week. We will move on to Pride and Prejudice. So as usual, I'll begin by recapping the events in the chapters that we read last week before I move on to chapters that we haven't seen before. So in chapter 27, Elizabeth informs Lady Catherine that she will be leaving for town soon, in spite of the latter's protest to the contrary. Elizabeth reflects that while she has an altogether better opinion of Mr. Darcy now, she still could not marry him if the offer were made again. Elizabeth and Maria leave, with various formalities properly attended to. Elizabeth stays with Jane at Mr. Gardiner's house for a few days, but decided to wait until she was home at Longbourn, but decides to wait until she is at home at Longbourn to tell her sister of Mr. Darcy's marriage proposal, fearing that if she were to be rash in deciding what to leave in and out of the account, she might accidentally be obligated to also inform Jane of something of Mr. Bingley which might only grieve Jane further. Kitty and Lydia meet Jane, Elizabeth and Maria at an inn before the entire party return together to Longbourn. Much gossip is exchanged, mostly on Kitty and Lydia's side. Elizabeth dreads seeing Mr. Wickham, and as she knows that in a fortnight his regiment is to leave, she intends to largely stay home until the situation remedies itself. In chapter 40, Elizabeth informs Jane about Mr. Darcy's marriage proposal and about what she's learned of Mr. Wickham's wicked nature, as it was reported to her. Jane and Elizabeth conspire that it's best not to disclose the particulars of Mr. Wickham's true nature any further, partly as their knowledge of this matter was imparted in confidence, and partly as the general prejudice against Mr. Darcy has become so ubiquitous and pronounced that many might be too proud to change their opinions of him now, or at least would suffer great embarrassment. So, that's as far as we had read last week. So, chapter 41. The first week of their return was soon gone. The second began. It was the last of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were drooping apace. I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that. Apace, quickly, rapidly, with speed. Okay, what do they mean by drooping? That droops or droop. That's what I would have thought. Does droop have another meaning? To hang down or to sag, to slowly become limp, to bend gradually, to lose all energy, enthusiasm or happiness, to flag. Okay, that will be it. And all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were drooping apace. The dejection was almost universal. The elder Miss Bennets alone was still able to eat, drink and sleep and pursue the usual course of their employments. Very frequently were they reproached for their insensibility by Kitty and Lydia, whose own misery was extreme and who could not comprehend such hard-heartedness in any of the family. Good heavens, what is to become of us? What are we to do? Would they often exclaim in the bitterness of woe. How can you be smiling so, Lizzie? Their affectionate mother shared all their grief. She remembered what she had herself endured on a similar occasion 25 years ago. I'm sure, said she, I cried for 2 days together when Colonel Miller's regiment went away. I thought I should have broken my heart. I'm sure I shall break mine, said Lydia. If one could but go to Brighton, observed Mrs. Bennet. Oh yes, if one could but go to Brighton, but Papa is so disagreeable. A little sea bathing would set me up forever, and my Aunt Phillips is sure it would do me a great deal of good, added Kitty. Such were the kind lamentations resounding perpetually through Longbourn House. Elizabeth tried to be diverted by them, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. She felt anew the justice of Mr. Darcy's objections, and never had she been so much disposed to pardon his interference in the views of his friend. But the gloom of Lydia's prospect was shortly cleared away, for she received an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. This invaluable friend was a very young woman, and very lately married. A resemblance in good humour and good spirits had recommended her and Lydia to each other, and out of their 3 months' acquaintance they had been intimate too. The rapture of Lydia on this occasion, her adoration of Mrs. Forster, the delight of Mrs. Bennet, and the mortification of Kitty are scarcely to be described. Wholly inattentive to her sister's feelings, Lydia flew about the house in restless ecstasy, calling for everyone's congratulations and laughing and talking with more violence than ever, whilst the luckless Kitty continued in the parlour repining at her fate in terms as unreasonable as her accent was peevish. I cannot say why Mrs. Forster should not ask me as well as Lydia, said she. Though I am not her particular friend, I have just as much right to be asked as she has, and more too, for I am 2 years older. In vain did Elizabeth attempt to make her reasonable, and Jane to make her resigned. As for Elizabeth herself, this invitation was so far from exciting in her the same feelings as in her mother and Lydia, that she considered it as the death warrant of all possibility of common sense for the latter. And detestable as such a step must make her, were it known, she could not help secretly advising her father not to let her go. She represented to him all the improprieties of Lydia's general behaviour, the little advantage she could derive from the friendship of such a woman as Mrs. Forster, and the probability of her being yet more imprudent with such a companion at Brighton, where the temptations must be greater than at home. He heard her attentively, and then said, Lydia will never be easy until she has exposed herself in some public place or other, and we can never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience to her family as under the present circumstances. If you were aware, said Elizabeth, of the very great disadvantage to us all which must arise from the public notice of Lydia's unguarded and imprudent manner, nay, which has already arisen from it, I am sure you would judge differently in the affair. Already arisen, repeated Mr. Bennet. What, has she frightened away some of your lovers, poor little Lizzie? But do not be cast down. Such squeamish youths as cannot bear to be connected with a little absurdity are not worth a regret. Come, let me see the list of pitiful fellows who has been kept aloof by Lydia's follies. Indeed, you are mistaken. I have no such injuries to resent. It is not of particular, but of general evils which I am complaining. Our importance, our respectability in the world must be affected by the wild volatility, the assurances and disdain of all restraint which mark Lydia's character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly. If you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits, and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment. Her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself or her family ridiculous. A flirt, too, in the worst and meanest degree of flirtation, without any attraction beyond youth and a tolerable person, and from the ignorance and emptiness of her mind, wholly unable to ward off any portion of that universal contempt which her rage for admiration will excite. In this danger Kitty also is comprehended. She will follow wherever Lydia leads. Vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. Oh, my dear father, can you suppose it possible that they will not be censured and despised wherever they are known, and that their sisters will not often be involved in the disgrace? Mr. Bennet saw that her whole heart was in the subject, and affectionately taking her hand, said in reply, Do not make yourself uneasy, my love. Wherever you and Jane are known, you must be respected and valued. You will not appear to be less advantage for having a couple of, or may I say 3, very silly sisters. We shall have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go. Then, Colonel Forster is a sensible man, and will keep her out of any real mischief, and she is luckily too poor to be an object of prey to anybody. But Brighton shall be of less importance even as a common flirt than she has been here. The officer will find women better worth their notice. Let us hope, therefore, that her being there may teach her her own insignificance at any rate. Her own insignificance. At any rate, she cannot grow many degrees worth without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life. With this answer, Elizabeth was forced to be content, but her own opinion continued the same, and she left disappointed and sorry. It was not in her nature, however, to increase her vexations by dwelling on them. She was confident of having performed her duty, and to fret over unavoidable evils or augment them by anxiety was no part of her disposition. Had Lydia and her mother known the substance of her conference with her father, their indignation would hardly have found expression in their united volubility. Oh, as in having a lot of volume, possibly? Nope. The state of being voluble. Fluent or having ready flow of speech. Of thoughts or feelings, something that is expressed readily or at length and in a fluent manner. Easily rolling or turning, having a fluid, undulating motion, twisting and turning like a vine. Okay. Voluble. Had Lydia and her mother known the substance of her conference with her father, their indignation would hardly have found expression in their united volubility. In Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton comprised every possibility of earthly happiness. She saw, with the creative eye of fancy, the streets of that gay bathing place covered with officers. She saw herself the object of attention to tens and to scores of them at present unknown. She saw all the glories of the camp. Its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with young men and the gay, and with the young and the gay, and dazzling with scarlet. And to complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least six officers at once. Had she known her sister sought to tear her from such prospects and such realities as these, she would have been her. What would have been her sensations? They could have been understood only by her mother, who might have felt nearly the same. Lydia's going to Brighton was all that consoled her for her melancholy conviction of her father's never intending to go there himself. But they were entirely ignorant of what had passed, and their raptures continued with little intermission to the very day of Lydia's leaving home. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. Having been frequently in company with him since her return, agitation was pretty well over, the agitations of former partiality entirely so. She had even learnt to detect, in the very gentleness which had first delighted her, an affectation and sameness to disgust and weary. In his present behaviour to himself, moreover, she had a fresh source of displeasure, for the inclination he soon testified of renewing those intentions which had marked the early part of their acquaintance could only serve, after what had since passed, to provoke her. She lost all concern for him in finding herself thus selected as the object of such idle and frivolous gallantry, and while she steadily repressed it, could not but feel the reproof contained in his believing that however long and for whatever cause his attentions had been withdrawn, her vanity would be gratified and her preference secured at any time by their renewal. On the very last day of the regiment's remaining at Meryton he dined, with others of the officers at Longbourn, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humour, that on his making some inquiry as to the manner in which her time had passed in Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy's having both spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him if he was acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed. With a moment's recollection and a returning smile, replied that he had formerly seen him often, and after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. Her answer was warmly in his favour. With an air of indifference he soon afterwards added, "How long did you say he was at Rosings?" "Nearly 3 weeks. And you saw him frequently?" "Yes, almost every day." "His manners are very different from his cousin's." "Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves upon acquaintance." "Indeed!" cried Mr. Wickham, with a look in which did not escape her. "And pray, may I ask?" But checking himself, he added in a gayer tone, Is it an address that he improves? Has he deigned to add aught of civility to his ordinary style? For I dare not hope," he continued in a lower and more serious tone, "that he is improved in essentials." "Oh no," said Elizabeth, "in essentials I believe he is very much what he ever was." While she spoke, Wickham looked as if scarcely knowing whether to rejoice over her words or to distrust their meaning. There was a something in her countenance which made him listen with an apprehensive and anxious attention, while she added, "When I said that he improved on acquaintance, I did not mean that his mind or his manners were in the state of improvement, but that, from knowing him better, his disposition was better understood." Wickham's alarm now appeared in a heightened complexion and agitated look. For a few minutes he was silent, till, shaking off his embarrassment, he turned to her again, and said in the gentlest of accents, "You, who so well know my feelings towards Mr. Darcy, will readily comprehend how sincerely I must rejoice that he is wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right. His pride in that direction may be of service, if not to himself, to many others, for it must only deter him from such foul misconduct as I have suffered by. I only fear that the sort of cautiousness to which you, I imagine, have been alluding, is merely adopted on his visits to his aunt, of whose good opinion and judgment he stands much in awe. His fear of her was always operated, I know, when they were together, and a good deal is to be imputed to his wish of forwarding the match with Mr. Burr, which I am certain he has very much at heart. Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of the head. She saw he wanted to engage her on the old subject of his grievances, and she was in no humour to indulge him. The rest of the evening passed with the appearance, on his side, of useful cheerfulness, but with no further attempt to distinguish Elizabeth, and they parted at last with mutual civility, and possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again. When the party broke up, Lydia returned with Mrs. Forrester to Meryton, from whence they were to set out early the next morning. The separation between her and her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did not weep from vexation and envy. Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she should not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible. Advice which there was every reason to believe would be well attended to, and in the clamorous happiness of Lydia herself in bidding farewell, the more gentle adieus of her sister were uttered without being heard. Chapter 42. Had Elizabeth's opinion been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing opinion of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of humour which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment which his own imprudence had brought on, in any of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly or their vice. He was fond of the country and of books, and from these tastes had arisen his principal enjoyments. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe to his wife, but where other powers of entertainment are wanting, the true philosopher will derive benefit from such as are given. Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behaviour as a husband. She had always seen it with pain, but respecting his abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavoured to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly reprehensible. For she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged direction of talents which, rightly used, might at least have preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause of satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. Their parties abroad were less varied than before, and at home she had a mother and sister whose constant repinings at the dullness of everything around them threw a real gloom over the domestic circle, and though Kitty might in time regain her natural degree of sense, since the disturbers of her brain were removed, her other sister, from whose disposition greater evil might be apprehended, from whose own disposition greater evil might be apprehended, was likely to be hardened in all her folly and assurance by a situation of such double danger as a watering place and a camp. Upon the whole, therefore, she found, what has been sometimes found before, that an event to which she had looked forward with impatient desires did not, in taking place, bring all the satisfaction she had promised herself. It was consequently necessary to name some other period for the commencement of actual felicity, to have some other point on which her wishes and hopes might be fixed, and by again enjoying the pleasures of anticipation, console herself for the present, and prepare for another disappointment. Her tour to the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable. And could she have included Jane in the scheme, every part of it would have been perfect. But it is fortunate, thought she, that I have something to wish for. Were the whole arrangement complete, my disappointment would be certain. But here, by carrying with me one ceaseless source of regret in my sister's absence, I may reasonably hope to have all my expectations of pleasure realized. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and general disappointment is only warded off by the defence of some little peculiar vexation. When Lydia went away, she promised to write very often and very minutely to her mother and Kitty. But her letters were always long expected and always very short. Those to her mother contained little else than that they were just returned from the library, where such and such officer had attended them, and where she had seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild, that she had a new gown or a new parasol, which she would have described more fully, but was obliged to leave off in a violent hurry, as Mrs. Forster called her. And they were going off to the camp, and from her correspondence with her sister there was still less to be learnt. From her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. I'm not sure I fully understood that. For her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean by too full of lines under the words. Still, after the first fortnight, or rather 3 weeks of her absence, health, good humour, and cheerfulness began to reappear at Longbourn. Everything wore a happier aspect. The families who had been in town for the winter came back again, and summer finery and summer engagements arose. Mrs. Bennet was restored to her usual... is that quarrelsome? No. What is that word? Querulous? I think that is querulous. So yes, I'm going to assume that's querulous. Mrs. Bennet was restored to her usual querulous serenity, and by the middle of June Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Meryton without tears, an event of such happy promise as to make Elizabeth hope that by the following Christmas she might be so tolerably reasonable as to make mention an officer above once a day. She might not to mention an officer above once a day, unless by some cruel and malicious arrangement at the War Office, another regiment should be quartered in Meryton. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, and a fortnight only was wanting of it when a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner, which at once delayed its commencement and curtailed its extent. Mr. Gardiner would be prevented by business from setting out till a fortnight later in July, and must be in London again within a month, and as that left too short a period for them to go so far, and see so much as they had promised, or at least to see it with the leisure and comfort they had built on, were obliged to give up the lakes and substitute a more contracted tour, and according to the present plan, were to go no further northwards than Derbyshire. In that country there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks, and to Mrs. Gardiner it had a peculiarly strong attraction. The town where she had formerly passed some years of her life, and where they were now to spend a few days, was probably as great an object of her curiosity as all the celebrated beauties of Matlock, Chatsworth, and Dovedale, or the Peak. Elizabeth was excessively disappointed, but she had set her heart on seeing the lakes, and still thought there might have been time enough. It was her business to be satisfied, and certainly her temper to be happy, and all was soon right again. With the mention of Derbyshire there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for her to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, but surely, said she, I might enter his county with impunity, and rob it of a few petrified spars without his perceiving me. What do I mean by spars? A raft of a roof, a thick pole or piece of wood, a bar of wood used to fasten a door, any linear object used as a mast, sprite, yard, boom, pole or gaff, beam-like structure member that supports ribbon, aircraft wing or other aerofoil. Well, it's not going to be that last one. To bolt the bar, to supply or equip, to fight against this practice for martial arts or hand-to-hand combat, to strike with the feet or spurs as cocks do, to contest in words, to wrangle, any various microcrystalline minerals of light, translucent or transparent appearance which are easy to cleft, any crystal with readily discernible faces. Oddly, that seems like the most likely. So she's thinking of taking some interesting minerals. Because the only other thing petrified spars could presumably mean is a petrified bit of wood, but specifically one that was a long pole. And perhaps I'm missing some context, but that doesn't make sense to me. So I suppose she must be referring to collecting some minerals? Interesting. I'll check my physical dictionary. That might have other uses of the word. My physical dictionary lists the exact same usages, and in particular it says kinds of crystalline mineral easily cleavable and non-lustrous. So I would suggest that's probably what it means. The period of expectation was now doubled. 4 weeks were to pass away before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did pass away. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, did at length appear at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old, and 2 younger boys, were to be left under the particular care of their cousin Jane, who was the general favourite, and whose steady sense and sweetness of temper exactly adapted her for attending to them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. The Gardiners stayed only one night at Longbourn, and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that of suitableness of companions, a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to bear inconveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence, which might supply it among themselves if there were disappointments abroad. If not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor any of the remarkable places through which their route hither lay, it is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor any of the remarkable places through which their route hither lay. Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, etc., are sufficiently known. A small part of Derbyshire is all the present concern. To the little town of Lambton, the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former residence, and where she had lately learned some acquaintance still remained. They bent their steps after having seen all the principal wonders of the country. Not sure what they mean by they bent their steps. And within 5 miles of Lambton, Elizabeth found from her aunt that Pemberley was situated. It was not in their direct road, nor more than a mile or 2 out of it. In talking over their route the evening before, Mrs. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Mr. Gardiner declared his willingness, and Elizabeth was applied to for her approbation. "My love, should you not like to see a place of which you have heard so much?" said her aunt. "A place, too, with which so many of your acquaintances are connected. Wickham passed all his youth there, you know." Elizabeth was distressed. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley, was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. She must own that she was tired of seeing great houses after going over so many, and truly had no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. Mrs. Gardiner abused her stupidity. "If it were merely a fine house, richly furnished," said she, "I should not care about it myself, but the grounds are delightful. They have some of the finest woods in the country." Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place instantly occurred. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea, for it would be better to speak openly to her aunt than to run such a risk. But against this there were objections. She finally resolved that it could be the last resource, if her private inquiries to the absence of the family were unfavourably answered. Accordingly, when she retired at night, she asked the chambermaid whether Pemberley were not a very fine place, and what was the name of its proprietor, and with no little alarm whether the family were down for the summer. A most welcome negative followed the last question, and her alarms now being removed, she was at leisure to feel a great deal of curiosity to see the house herself. When the subject was revived the next morning, and she was again applied to, could readily answer, and with a proper air of indifference, that she had not really any dislike to the scheme. To Pemberley, therefore, they were to go. Approbation. I want to look that up quickly. The act of approving and assenting to the the act of approving and assenting to the propriety of a thing with some degree of pleasure or satisfaction, approval, sanction, commendation, or official recognition. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned in the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. The park was very large and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was too full of conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile, and then found themselves at the top of considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley, in which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door, and while examining the nearer aspect of the house, all her apprehension of meeting its owner returned. She dreaded lest the chambermaid had been mistaken. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth, as they waited for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. The housekeeper came, a respectable-looking elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. They followed her into the dining parlour. It was a large, very well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to the window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with wood, which they had descended, receiving increased abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on its banks, and the winding of the valley, as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and the furniture suitable to the fortune of its proprietor, but Elizabeth saw, with admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendour and more elegance than the furniture of Rosings. And of this place, thought she, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might now have been familiar acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them as my own, and welcomed to them as visitors my uncle and aunt. But no, recollecting herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from some very like it saved her from something very like regret. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master was really absent, but had not the courage for it. At length, however, the question was asked by her uncle. She turned away with alarm, while Mrs. Reynolds replied that he was. While Mrs. Reynolds replied that he was, adding, "We will expect him tomorrow with a large party of friends." How rejoiced was Elizabeth that her own journey had not by any circumstance been delayed a day. Her aunt now called her to look at a picture. She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham, suspended amongst several other miniatures over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked, smiling, how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward and told them it was a picture of a young gentleman, the son of a late master steward, who had been brought up by him at his own expense. He has now gone into the army, she added, but I am afraid that he has turned out very wild. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. And that, said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, is my master, and very like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago. I've heard much of your master's fine person, said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. It is a handsome face, but Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is like or not. Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this intimation of her knowing her master. Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy? Elizabeth coloured and said, a little. And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, man? Yes, very handsome. And I am sure I know none so handsome. But in the gallery upstairs you will see a finer, larger picture of him than you will see a finer, larger picture of him than this. This room was my late master's favourite room, and these miniatures are just as they used to be then. He was very fond of them. This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Miss Darcy, drawn when she was only 8 years old. "And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother?" said Mrs. Gardiner. "Oh, yes, the handsomest young lady that ever was seen, and so accomplished. She plays and sings all day long. In the next room is a new instrument just come down for her, a present from my master. She comes here tomorrow with him." Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were very easy and pleasant, encouraged her communicativeness by his questions and remarks. Mrs. Reynolds, either by pride or attachment, had evidently great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. "Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year?" "Not so much as I could wish, sir, but I dare say he may spend half his time here, and Miss Darcy is always down for the summer months." "Except," thought Elizabeth, "when she goes to Ramsgate." "If your master would marry, you might see more of him." "Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, "It is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you should think so. I say no more than the truth, and everybody will say that knows him." Replied the other. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, "I have never known a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old." This was praise. Of all others most extraordinary, most opposite to her ideas. He was a good-tempered man had been his firmest opinion. That he was not a good-tempered man had been her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awakened. She longed to hear more, and was grateful to her uncle for saying, "There are very few people of whom so much can be said. You're lucky in having such a master." "Yes, sir, I know I am. If I were to go through the world, I could not meet with a better. But I've always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they are grown up, and he was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world." Elizabeth almost stared at her. "Can this be Mr. Darcy?" thought she. "His father was an excellent man," said Mrs. Gardiner. "Yes, ma'am, that he was indeed, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor." Elizabeth listened, wondered, doubted, and was impatient for more. Mrs. Reynolds could interest her on no other point. She related the subjects of the pictures, the dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture in vain. Mr. Gardiner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master, soon led again to the subject, and she dwelt with energy on his many merits as they proceeded together up the great staircase. "He is the best landlord and the best master," said she, "that ever lived, not like the wild young men down nowadays who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants or servants but will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men." "And what an amiable light does this place him," thought Elizabeth. "This fine account of him," whispered her aunt as they walked, "is not quite consistent with his behaviour to our poor friend. Perhaps we might be deceived. That is not very likely. Our authority was too good." On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting-room, lately fitted up with greater elegance and lightness than the apartments below, and were informed that it was but just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. "He is certainly a good brother," said Elizabeth as she walked towards one of the windows. Mrs. Reynolds anticipated Miss Darcy's delight when she should enter the room. "And this is always the way with him," she added. "Whatever can give his sister any pleasure is sure to be done in a moment. There is nothing he would not do for her." The picture gallery and 2 or 3 of the principal bedrooms were all that remained to be shown. In the former were many good paintings, but Elizabeth knew nothing of the art, and from such as had been already visible below she had willingly turned to look at some drawings of Miss Darcy in crayons. His subjects were usually more interesting and also more intelligible. Well, that's a fascinating sentence, isn't it? First of all, they had crayons back then. I suppose that makes sense, because crayons are made of a waxy substance, aren't they? And they certainly had plenty of waxes. I just never thought of it. But also that they would describe Miss Darcy's drawings as more intelligible than that of, presumably, the subjects of fine art. Or at least fine paintings. Because I'm very confident that the more abstract art styles hadn't arisen yet. Art went through many periods, but they were more characterized by subject and emphasis than of deviating from reality in the way that you would see from Cubism or even Impressionism, for example. At least that is my understanding. So, interesting. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance to Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture, in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before they quitted the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken in his father's lifetime. There was certainly at this moment, in Elizabeth's mind, a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt at the height of their acquaintance. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship. How much of pleasure or pain was it in his power to bestow? How much of good or evil must be done by him? Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favourable to his character, and she stood before the canvas on which he was represented, and fixed his eyes upon herself. She thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth, and softened its impropriety of expression. When all of the house that was open to general inspection had been seen, they returned downstairs, and, taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. As they walked across the hall towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt stopped also, and while the former was conjecturing as to the date of the building, the owner of it himself suddenly came forward from the road, which led behind it to the stables. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of both were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party, and spoke to Elizabeth. It was not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. Oh, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. She had instinctively turned away, but stopping on his approach, received his compliments with an embarrassment impossible to be overcome. I do apologise, I seem to be making a lot of mistakes today. Had his first appearance, or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining, been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what to answer. She returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the alteration of his manner since they had last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of the impropriety of her being found there recurring to her mind. The few minutes in which they continued were some of the most uncomfortable in her life. nor did she seem much more at ease when he spoke. His accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries as to the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her stay in Derbyshire, so often and in so hurried a way, as plainly spoke the distraction of his thoughts. That's interesting. They consider inquiries that are frequent and hurried as being indicators of a distracted mind. At length every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. The others then joined her, and expressed admiration of his figure, but Elizabeth heard not a word, and wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. She was overpowered by shame and vexation. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange it must appear to him! In what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man! It might seem as if she had purposely thrown herself in his way again. Oh, did she come? Oh, why did she come? Or why did she thus come a day before he was expected? Had they been only 10 minutes sooner, they should have been beyond the reach of his discrimination, for it was plain that he was that moment arrived, that moment alighted from his horse or his carriage. She blushed again and again over the perverseness of the meeting, and his behaviour so strikingly altered. What could it mean? That he should even speak to her was amazing, but to speak with such civility, to inquire after her family, never in her life had she seen his manners so little dignified. Never had he spoken with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. What contrast did it offer to the last address in Rosings Park, when he put his letter into her hand. She knew not what to think, or how to account for it. Interesting that they refer to his manners as so little dignified. I suppose that's because he has a distracted mind. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of ground, or a finer reach of the woods to which they were approaching. But it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible of any of it, and though she answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, and seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed, she distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Pemberley House, whichever it might be, where Mr. Darcy then was. She longed to know what at the moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether, in defiance of everything, she was still dear to him. Perhaps he had been civil only because he felt himself at ease, yet there had been that in his voice which was not like ease. Whether he had felt more pain or of pleasure in seeing her, she could not tell, but he certainly had not seen her with composure. At length, however, the remarks of her companions on her absence of mind aroused her, and she felt the necessity of appearing more like herself. They entered the woods, and bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher grounds, when, in spots where the opening of the trees gave the eyes power to wander, were many charming views of the valley and opposite hills, with a long range of woods overspreading many, and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going round the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile they were told that it was 10 miles round. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again after some time in a descent among hanging woods to the edge of the water, and one of its narrowest parts. They crossed it by simple bridge, in character with the general air of the scene. It was a spot less adorned than any they had yet visited, and the valley, here contracted into a glen, allowed room only for the stream and a narrow walk amidst the rough coppiced wood which bordered it. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but when they had crossed the bridge and perceived their distance from the house, Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no further, and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was, therefore, obliged to submit, and they took their way towards the house on the opposite side of the river, in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardiner, though seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was so much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water, and talking to the man about them, that he advanced but little. Whilst wandering on in this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what it had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no great distance. The walk being here less sheltered than on the other side, allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness. If he really intended to meet them, prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet them. For a few moments, indeed, she felt that he would probably strike into some other path. The idea lasted while a turning in the walk concealed him from their view. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance, she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and, to imitate his politeness, she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place. But she had not got beyond the words delightful and charming, when some unlucky recollections obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Pemberley from her might be mischievously construed. Her colour changed, and she said no more. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind, and on her pausing, he asked her if she would do him the honour of introducing him to her friends. This was a stroke of civility for which she was quite unprepared, and she could hardly suppress a smile at his being now seeking the acquaintance of some of those very people against whom his pride had revolted in his offer to herself. What will be his surprise, thought she, when he knows who they are? He takes them now for people of fashion. The introduction, however, was immediately made, and as she named their relationship to herself, she stole a sly look at him, to see how he bore it, and was not without the expectation of his decamping as fast as he could from such disgraceful companions. That he was surprised by the connection was evident. He sustained it, however, with fortitude, and so far from going away, turned back with them, and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not but be pleased, could not but triumph. It was consoling that she should know she had some relations for whom there was no need to blush. She listened more attentively to all that passed between them, and gloried in every expression, every sentence of her uncle, which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. The conversation soon turned upon fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him, with the greatest civility, to fish there as often as he chose while he continued in the neighbourhood, offering at the same time to supply him with fishing tackle, and pointing out these parts of the stream where there was usually most sport. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave her a look expressive of wonder. Elizabeth said nothing, but it gratified her exceedingly. The compliment must be all for herself. Her astonishment, however, was extreme, and continually was she repeating, "Why is he so altered? From what can it proceed? It cannot be for me, it cannot be for my sake that his manners are thus softened. My reproofs at Hunsford could not work such a change as this. It is impossible that he should still love me." After walking some time in this way, the two ladies in front, the two gentlemen behind, on resuming their places after descending to the brink of the river for the better inspection of some curious water plant, there chanced to be a little alteration. It originated in Mrs. Gardiner, who, fatigued by the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm inadequate to her support, and consequently preferred her husband's. Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece, and they walked on together. After a short silence, the lady first spoke. She wished him to know that she had been assured of his absence before she came to the place, and accordingly began by observing that his arrival had been very unexpected. "For your housekeeper," she added, "informed us that you would certainly not be here till tomorrow, and indeed before we left Bakewell we understood that you were not immediately expected in the country." He acknowledged the truth of it all, and said that business with his steward had occasioned his coming forward a few hours before the rest of the party with whom he had been travelling. "They'll join me early tomorrow," he continued, "and among them are some who will claim an acquaintance with you, Mr. Bingley and his sisters." Elizabeth answered only by a slight bow. Her thoughts were instantly driven back to the time when Mr. Bingley's name had been the last mentioned between them, and if she might judge by his complexion, his mind was not very differently engaged. There is also one other person in the party, he continued after a pause, who more particularly wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to your acquaintance during your stay at Lambton? The surprise of such an application was great indeed. It was too great for her to know in what manner she acceded to it. She immediately felt that whatever desire Miss Darcy might have of being acquainted with her must be the work of her brother, and, without looking farther, it was satisfactory. It was gratifying to know that his resentment had not made him think really ill of her. They now walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Elizabeth was not comfortable. That was impossible. But she was flattered and pleased. His wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. They soon outstripped the others, and when they had reached the carriage, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were half a quarter of a mile behind. He then asked her to walk into the house, but she declared herself not tired, and they stood together on the lawn. At such a time much might have been said, and silence was very awkward. She wanted to talk, but there seemed to be an embargo on every subject. At last she recollected that she had been travelling, and they talked of Matlock and Dovedale, with great perseverance. Yet time and her aunt moved slowly, and her patience and ideas were nearly worn out before the tete-a-tete was over. On Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's coming up, they were all pressed to go into the house and take some refreshment, but this was declined, and they parted on each side with utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when it drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. The observations of her uncle and aunt now began, and each of them pronounced him to be infinitely superior to anything they had expected. "He is perfectly well behaved, polite, and unassuming," said her uncle. "There is something a little stately in him, to be sure," replied her aunt, "but it is confined to his air, and it is not unbecoming. I can now say with the housekeeper that, though some people may call him proud, I have seen nothing of it. I was never more surprised than by his behaviour to us. It was more than civil, it was really attentive, and there was no necessity for such attention. His acquaintance with Elizabeth was very trifling." "To be sure, Lizzie," said her aunt, "he is not so handsome as Wickham, or rather he is not Wickham's countenance, for his features are perfectly good. But how came you to tell me that he was so disagreeable?" Elizabeth excused herself as well as she could, said that she had liked him better when they had met in Kent than before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. "But perhaps he may be a little whimsical in his civilities," replied her uncle. Your great men often are, and therefore I shall not take him at his word, as he might change his mind another day, and warn me off his grounds." Elizabeth felt that they had entirely misunderstood his character, but said nothing. "From what we have seen of him," continued Mrs. Gardiner, "I really should not have thought that he could have behaved in so cruel a way by anybody as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavourable idea of his heart. But to be sure, the good lady who showed us his house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laughing aloud sometimes. But he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that, in the eye of a servant, comprehends every virtue. Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his behaviour to Wickham, and therefore gave them to understand, in as guarded as a manner as she could, that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction, and that his character was by no means so faulty, nor Wickham so amiable, as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating it to be such as might be relied on. Mrs. Gardner was surprised and concerned, but as they were now approaching the scene of her former pleasures, every idea gave way to the charm of recollection, and she was too much engaged in pointing out to her husband all the interesting spots in its environs to think of anything else. Fatigued as she had been by the morning's walk, they had no sooner dined than she set off again in the quest of her former acquaintance, and the evening was spent in the satisfaction of an intercourse renewed after many years' discontinuance. The occurrences of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention for any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think with wonder of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all, of his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister. So, that concludes the Pride and Prejudice for this week. So, let us move on to riddles. So, I believe riddle 71 must be the one that we left off on last week. Ladies, I pray, my name declare, for surely without me you neither could be tall nor fair, nor could you clearly see. Graceful you never would be deemed, nor amiable nor smart. And though you might be much esteemed, you'd never gain a heart. To cards and dancing I'm a friend, at balls I'm often won, and though on vice I never attend, virtue I always shun. And I believe the solution to that riddle is the letter A, because it is in the word tall and it's in the word fair. Wait. Nor could you clearly see, so it can't be. What was the solution to this one? I seem to remember it was the linguistic solution. I will look it up. I'm confident that was one we did last week. So it was 71, wasn't it? Letter A. Yes, it was the letter A. Oh, of course, you couldn't clearly see. So it's A is in the word clearly. Yeah, so that was the solution to that one. So, moving on to 72. As moon round-faced, complexion white, that emulates her silver light, no post I occupy, and yet none can deny I'm of some weight. Rich though I am, none call me proud, splendid sun's vanity allowed. Sometimes I help a church to build, or comfort to the wretched yield. Latin like Romish priest I speak. Oh, Romish. Latin like Romish priest I speak, but know no more of it than Greek. For monarch's face never shrinks or care, though lions fierce attack my rear. Like Christian good take up my cross, and serve the country to my loss. From foreign lands I hither came, and now pray tell me what's my name. So once again, as moon round face, complexion white, that emulates her silver light, no post I occupy, and yet none can deny I'm of some weight. Rich though I am, none call me proud, splendid sun's vanity allowed. Sometimes I help a church to build, or comfort to the wretched yield. Latin like Romish priest I speak, but know no more of it than Greek. From monarch's face never shrink or care, though lions fierce attack my rear. I Christian good take up my cross, and serve the country to my loss. From foreign lands I hither came, and now pray tell me what's my name. The symbolism of a white moon with silver light and lions attacking are very interesting, but I don't get the reference. I feel that must be either well-known at the time personifications of the solution to this riddle, or in some other way imagery that was associated with it. But because I haven't picked up on the association, that's not helping very much. My best guess is that it could be the law. This idea of it coming from a foreign land, because they may be thinking of Roman law, which is often thought to be the earliest foundation of the British legal system. And there's certainly a lot of Latin spoken. And it's certainly a profession associated with wealth. And it's certainly weighty. So that's my best guess. I could be wrong. Does anyone else want to guess? And put it in chat before I look it up. Suppose not. And the answer is a shilling. Okay, I was well off. So, as moon round face, complexion white, that emulates a silver light, I can understand that that's what a shilling coin might look like. Having never actually... I don't think I must have seen pictures of shillings before. I was about to say, having never seen one in person, I don't think, but even if I haven't, I must have seen depictions of shillings. Yep. So I guess shillings around that time had a depiction of 3 lions on the back. And obviously it would have been the king's face on the front. That's my best guess. And it would have some sort of Latin expression on it. Okay, I really don't think I would have guessed that, but... But that makes some sense. This is a much later shilling coin. This has got Queen Elizabeth II on it. Her Royal Majesty. But you can see the lions. So it's particularly interesting in the lines like, Christian good, take up my cross and serve the country to my loss. So I suppose that refers to giving your money away to charity, I assume. and you're losing the shilling. Okay, 73. At length, ye charming British fair, your humble servants come to appear, to pay you once a visit. Your enigmatic wit, no doubt, will quickly find the riddle out, and show the world who is it. First in the bosom of the earth, a searching artist brought me forth, and from my mother drew me. Compelled I was to pass through fire, Vulcanian tortures, cruel dire, ere you, dear ladies, knew me. For use and service are known well, from peeress down to rustic now. They all confess my worth. I shield the fair from hourly harms, impede them daily from alarms, and serve them from their birth. A little serpent waits on me, who keen o' the sport is full of glee. I'm oft compelled to kiss him, but I though Holland sent him tours, waft him through borders of fine flowers, so quickly I dismiss him. To industry I'm slave, but if my inside or concave is empty, useless lie, yet when employed in public good, is filled with your dear flesh and blood. Now, ladies, what am I? That is a hard one. At length, ye charming British fair, your humble servants come to appear, to pay you once a visit. Your enigmatic wit, no doubt, will quickly find the riddle out, and show the world who it is. First in the bosom of the earth, a searching artist brought me forth, and from my mother drew me. Compelled I was to pass through fire, Vulcanian tortures, cruel, dire, ere you, dear ladies, knew me. My use and service are known well, from peeress down to rustic now. They all confess my worth. I shield the fair from hourly harms, and impede them daily from alarms, and serve them from their birth. A little serpent waits on me, who keen o' the sport is full of glee. I'm oft compelled to kiss him, but I though Holland sent him tours, waft him through borders of fine flowers, so quickly I dismiss him. To industry I am slave, but if my inside or concave is empty, useless lie, yet when employed in public good is filled with your dear flesh and blood. Now, ladies, what am I? I don't think I'm gonna get this one. I'm gonna have to look this one up, I'm sorry. Unless anyone in chat has a guess. I just can't imagine what it would be. I really can't. Thimble. Oh, that makes some sense. For sewing, of course. But why did they describe it as serving them from birth? Where was it? At length, ye charming British fair, your humble servants come to appear, to pay you once a visit. Your enigmatic wit, no doubt, will quickly find the riddle out, and show the world who it is. First in the bosom of the earth, a searching artist brought me forth. Not sure why they're an artist. And from my mother drew me, so from the earth, compelled I was to pass through fire, Vulcanian tortures cruel and dire, ere you dear ladies knew me. See, that makes sense, because that's referring presumably to gathering iron ore and then smelting it. My use and service are well known, from peeress down to rustic now. That makes sense, except I do actually doubt whether many peeresses would have been sewing themselves. I know back in those times, women were generally expected to know how to sew things. Even fairly well-to-do women, but I feel like by the time you're up to a peeress, they probably wouldn't be. You know, they would have so many servants that could do it for them. Like, I don't know. They all confess my worth. I shield the fair from hourly alarms. I impede them. From hourly harms, impede them daily from alarms, and serve them from their birth. See, those two make absolute sense with it being a thimble. That last one, I don't get. Why would it be serving them from their birth? A little serpent waits on me, who keen on the sport is full of glee. I'm oft compelled to kiss him, but I, though Holland, send him tawls, waft him through borders of fine flowers, so quickly I dismiss him. That makes no sense to me. My best guess is that perhaps through borders of fine flowers. Could that be some sort of cushion or something they would be sewing up against? But I don't think... But I assume that when you're sewing with a thimble on your finger, I would assume that the needle you're pushing through wouldn't be angled towards a cushion, would it? Like, you might have a cushion there, but I assume, like, if the needle collided with the thimble and was directed away, I assume it would just go into the air, wouldn't it? Could be wrong. To industry I'm a slave, that's true, but if my inside or concave is empty, useless lie. Okay, so if no one is... Essentially that means if someone's not actively using me, then I'm useless. Yet when employed in public good, is filled with your dear flesh and blood, the finger. Ah, now ladies, what am I? Okay. Yeah, I don't think I would have guessed that, but it makes sense in retrospect. That's not such a bad riddle. So we'll make 74 the last one. Let's hope I can get it, since I've obviously failed to get the 2 riddles so far. The 2 previous riddles. In places where mirth and good humour abound, who so welcome as I, or so commonly found? If I get among gamblers, I never am winner. Eat nothing, yet who can afford better dinner? At church of my privilege never bait an ace, not sure what that means. Not even to churchwarden or person give place. In verse or in prose there are few who indite, but to me they apply ere they venture to write. In council I'm present, not absent at tea. Nymphs who are courted by all come and pay court to me. They seek out my title, each spirited lover, who dares such a favourite rival discover. If I move not on 4 as I usually do, you may find me on 1 leg, but never on 2. Well, that last one sounds like the biggest clue of all. Sounds like a chair or a stool. Because there are 1-legged stools. I know that 1-legged stools were used by individuals who made charcoal. I've unfortunately forgotten the title of a charcoal maker, because they do have I say title, the name of that profession, because that profession does have a name. But the thing about making charcoal is that you essentially have to start a wood fire, but have it covered over in such a way that oxygen can't get in. I'm not an expert on the chemistry of it by any means. but essentially those conditions allow charcoal to be formed instead of the wood just turning into ash. Now, the important thing about this to note about this process is the fact that if you don't watch it carefully, then it can just go. The process can go wrong, and it may need constant attention to make sure that the burning isn't petering out early, or worse, getting out of control. Because I said blocking the access to oxygen, but I think it's more about massively restricting it, but still letting a little bit of oxygen in. And so that can be a problem. If too much air is getting in, then it will all just burn and turn to ash, which means you've just ruined a batch of charcoal. All of this is to say, those individuals used one-legged stools, so when watching charcoal heaps, because they need to be watched, and then if they fell asleep, they would fall over. So that's why the idea of having 4 or 1 legs particularly appealed to me. Although to be fair, there are plenty of stools with 3 legs as well. So perhaps not. Let's see. In places where mirth and good humour abound, who so welcome as I, also commonly found. If I get among gamblers, I never am winner. Eat nothing, yet who can afford better dinner? At church of my privilege, never bait an ace. Not even to churchwarden on a person give place. In verse or in prose, there are few who indict, but to me they apply ere they venture to write. That makes sense, because they need to sit down. In council I'm present, not absent at tea. Nymphs who are courted by all come and pay court to me. Then seek out my title, each spirited lover, who dares such a favourite rival discover. If I move not on 4, as I usually do, you may find me on 1 leg, but never on 2. It moves. Can't be a stall. Quite a lot of these lines didn't make sense anyway. But what moves on 1 leg? But usually has 4. I don't know. It's regrettable, but I'm gonna have to pass on all 3 riddles today. A table. I was close. But I didn't guess it. In place where mirth and good humour abound, who so welcome as I, also commonly found. If I get among gamblers, I never am winner. Eat nothing, yet who can afford better dinner? At church of my privilege, never bait an ace. Not even to churchwarden a person give place. In verse or in prose, there are few who indict, but to me they apply ere they venture to write. In council I'm present, not absent at tea. Nymphs who are courted by all come and pay court to me. Then seek out my title, each spirited lover, who dares such a favourite rival discover. Still don't understand that. If If I move not on 4, as I usually do, you may find me on one leg, but never on 2. Okay. Slightly disappointing end to the stream with my failing so badly on the riddles, but it happens. I hope you all enjoyed the stream. I will be streaming again on Friday, in which I will almost certainly be starting the game Stray. As I think I discussed at the end of last stream, I'm tempted to give up to abandon Pokemon Crystal at this point. There's just one more battle to do against Red, and he has very high level Pokemon. I could grind it out, but I don't know, it just feels like I know I could win by sheer grinding, getting to the point where my Pokemon are equal or higher level to him, but it would take so long. It wouldn't be enjoyable. It wouldn't be enjoyable for me. It wouldn't be enjoyable to watch. So it seems a bit pointless. And given that is literally the very last thing to be done in the game, I am happy to call it there. So with that said, I will almost certainly be beginning the game Stray on Friday from 4 o'clock. Saturday's stream, if I do it, will also be from 4 as usual. I usually stream from 4. And that'll be, if I do it, more Stray. Monday... well, we finished Grim Fandango, didn't we? And I had been thinking of moving towards only having one game on my channel at a time rather than doing 2. So that may be Stray as well. And then Wednesday will be back round to poetry, prose and riddles. If any of that changes, then I'll be sure to announce it online on Twitter. So once again, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope you have a wonderful night. Good night.